The chamber was built to make you feel small. Sarah Voss had known this before she walked in. She had read the architectural reports, studied the schematics, even looked at the angles of the light panels, how they were tilted just enough to flood the delegate platforms with warm gold and leave the human seat in something close to shadow. The ceiling was 200 meters high. The floor was polished obsidian. Every surface reflected you back at yourself, slightly smaller than you actually were. She had brought a coffee mug. It was old, ceramic, chipped at the handle where she had dropped it on a metal floor 12 years ago, and not bothered to replace it. The words, New Carthage Mining Co., were stenciled on the side in orange letters that had mostly gone gray. She set it on the delegation table in front of her, poured from the thermos she had carried in her coat pocket, and drank while the chamber filled around her. 7 species, 8 centuries of collective diplomatic history, arranged in a horseshoe of tiered platforms, all facing her. She was the only human in the room. She was the only human who had been invited. That had been deliberate too. She understood that. Grand Chancellor Vethara of the Muhari arrived last. He always arrived last. He was 4,000 years old, which was a thing Voss had never quite managed to make feel real inside her head. And he moved like something that had learned patience so completely it had become structural. Built into the way he crossed a room, the way he settled into his seat, the way his 8 limbs arranged themselves with a slowness that was not laziness, but something more like certainty. His bioluminescence pulsed a slow, deep blue. Calm. Ceremonial. He looked at her coffee mug for a moment. Then he began to read. The Declaration of Civilizational Correction was 11 minutes long. Voss had known it would be approximately 11 minutes, because she had read the preliminary draft, which the Council had not known she had access to. It covered humanity's violations of the Covenant Accords, 17 of them, documented, dated, cross-referenced. It covered the Council's attempts at resolution, 22 attempts over 6 years, each one rebuffed or stalled or allowed to die quietly in committee. It covered the Council's conclusion, arrived at after great deliberation, that humanity represented a systemic threat to galactic order, and that corrective action was not only justified, but required. It was a thorough document. It was, in the specific way of things built by very old institutions, with a great deal of experience in making the wrong thing sound inevitable, beautiful. Voss drank her coffee. She was not performing calm. She was not suppressing fear. She had moved past the place where this room, or this moment, or these 29 delegates could produce fear in her. She had moved past that place 6 years ago, and she had been waiting ever since for this 11-minute document to catch up to her. She watched Vethara read. She watched the chamber. She watched the way the Keth delegates in the upper tier kept their secondary eyes on her, looking for the signs their behavioral models told them to look for. The elevated respiration, the micro-expressions of panic, the physical stillness of someone working very hard not to move, because moving would betray them. They were not finding those things. She could see it unsettling them. Good. His voice was resonant in the way that the room's acoustics were designed to make it resonant, and the words of the declaration landed in the chamber with the weight of architecture, of history, of 4,000 years of institutional confidence. He finished. The chamber held its breath. 29 delegates, 7 species, 8 centuries of collective diplomatic history, all of it oriented toward this moment, toward the human response, toward the begging or the counteroffer or the careful diplomatic language of a species that understood it had lost before the first shot was fired. Voss set her coffee mug down on the table. She looked up. She said 2 words. At last. Not loud, not sharp. She said them the way you say something you have been waiting a long time to say. with the specific flatness of a person who has rehearsed the moment so many times that when it arrives, it does not feel like a moment at all. It feels like math finally resolving. The translators rendered it in 6 languages simultaneously. The chamber did not move. Vethara, 4,000 years old, 9 wars negotiated to their conclusions, had a framework for almost every response a species could produce in this moment. Pride, fury, grief, calculated defiance, desperate bargaining. He had seen all of them. He had learned to read all of them. He did not have a framework for this. He ran the translation again. At last. The phrase carried no ambiguity. It was not an idiom that broke across species lines. It was simple and direct, and it meant exactly what it said. He ran it a 3rd time. One of the Keth delegates made a sound, not quite a word, more like the auditory equivalent of stepping on something unexpected in a dark room. The Veth delegation had gone entirely still, in the way that the Veth went still when their nervous systems were doing something complicated. The Muhari delegate beside Vethara had her secondary limbs drawn in close, which in Muhari body language meant something between confusion and animal alertness. Voss picked up her coffee mug, drank. She was looking at a point somewhere past Vethara's left side, not at him, not at the chamber, at something that was not in this room and had not been in this room for a long time. At last, Vethara had been doing this for 4,000 years. He was very good at it. He knew how to read the thing underneath what a delegate said, the current running below the words, the actual meaning that protocol and translation and diplomatic register existed to partially conceal. He read the current underneath Sarah Voss's 2 words. He felt something move through him like cold water. Because it was not defiance. It was not a bluff. It was not the performance of a species that had decided to go down swinging and wanted to look dangerous in the last moments before the lights went out. It was relief. Old relief, the kind that lived on the other side of a very long wait. He had declared war on humanity an hour ago. This woman had been waiting for him to do it. He did not know what that meant yet. He needed time and data and the full resources of the Council's strategic intelligence apparatus to even begin to build a model for what that meant. His aide leaned in and murmured the schedule, the press statement, the fleet authorization, the formal transmission to human territorial space. Vethara nodded. He kept his eyes on Sarah Voss, who was finishing her coffee with the focused attention of someone who had somewhere else to be. She capped her thermos. She stood. She picked up the mug. She left. He ran the translation one more time. At last, the cold water feeling didn't go away. The Council's War Council met for 6 hours. Fleet projections, resource mapping, timeline modeling. The Muhari strategic AI had run 40,000 simulations over the past 3 years, quietly, in the background, because good institutions prepared for outcomes they were publicly committed to avoiding. In 38,000 of those simulations, humanity capitulated within 19 standard weeks. In the remaining 2,000, humanity lasted longer, but the end result was the same. The AI was very good. It was also the most advanced strategic intelligence system in the known galaxy. The delegates looked at the projections and felt the specific comfort of numbers that agreed with what they already believed. The Grand Chancellor Vethara looked at the projections and thought about the cold water feeling. He did not say anything about the cold water feeling. 4 years ago, a council intelligence analyst named Priva Soth had filed a report. It was 40 pages. It covered human-civilian behavior in the contested border zones along the Outer Covenant line, the regions where the political situation had been, for a careful person paying attention, clearly trending toward this moment for some time. Priva Soth had been a careful person. She had gone through years of behavioral data, migration patterns, resource stockpiling, psychological distress indicators, the markers that every species in the Council's history had displayed when they understood that something very bad was coming for them. She had not found those markers. That was the thing that had made her file the report in the first place. No mass exodus, no hoarding, no elevated stress indicators in any of the datasets that the Council's monitoring systems tracked. Human populations in the contested zones were doing what human populations did, working, building, arguing with each other about small local things, teaching their children, repairing their equipment. The behavioral signature of a species that did not know the floor was about to fall out from under them. Privasoff had written, in the report's conclusion, humans appear unaware of escalating risk. The report had been flagged, deprioritized. Privasoff had since received 2 promotions, and now worked in a different department entirely. Her conclusion had been wrong. Not about the data. The data was accurate. The humans in the contested zones were not hoarding resources, or flooding transit hubs, or displaying elevated stress. She had simply not had a framework for the other explanation, for the possibility that a species could look at the approaching floor and not panic, not because they couldn't see it coming, but because they had already been through enough floors that one more did not change the shape of their days. A species that has already lost everything is not afraid of losing it again. It is, in a very specific and terrible way, free. 6 years ago, Admiral Sarah Voss had stood in front of humanity's Joint Strategic Command with a single presentation slide. The slide had one thing on it, a number. The number of human wars in recorded history, from the first scratched accounts of organized violence in the oldest human archives to the present day. Every war, every organized attempt by one group of humans to destroy another group of humans for control of land, or resources, or ideology, or sometimes, as far as historians could tell, for reasons that did not fully survive the translation into the present. She let them look at it for a while. The number was very large. "We've had worse," she said. "Run it again." She meant run the projections again with this number as a variable. Run them with the understanding that the species you are modeling has been doing this specific thing, organized, large-scale, industrialized violence, for the entirety of its recorded history. That it has never at any point stopped. That every period of peace in human history is correctly understood as a pause between conflicts rather than a conclusion of them. The Strategic Command ran it again. The projections changed. Not in humanity's favor necessarily, but they changed. They became more complicated. They became the kind of projections that gave you a number, but quietly introduced uncertainty into everything around the number. Voss looked at the new projections. "That's the math," she said. She did not say, "and now we build toward it." She did not have to. The Council's first strike packages launched at 0300 Standard Time, 47 systems, coordinated. The planning had been meticulous. The fleet commanders were the best the Council had. The tactical approach was a thing of real precision. 47 simultaneous actions designed to overwhelm human response capacity before a coherent defense could be organized. To create chaos in the first 72 hours that would cascade into logistical collapse, which would cascade into political collapse, which would cascade into the kind of capitulation that the AI had modeled as the most likely outcome in 38,000 of its simulations. The first reports came back inside 3 hours. They looked like what the projections said they should look like. The Council War Council reviewed them and felt the specific comfort of data confirming what they already believed. At the 0600 review, the Muhari AI flagged an anomaly. Small, almost invisible. Human response timing across all 47 zones. 0.003 seconds faster than modeled. Consistently, simultaneously, as if the 47 engagements were not 47 separate defensive reactions, but one. The AI reviewed its own flag. It reclassified the anomaly. Statistical noise. It moved on. In her quarters on the command ship Resolute, Sarah Voss received the battle reports and read them with the focused attention of someone checking a grocery list. Names, numbers, systems, outcomes. She read the casualty figures. Human casualties. Her people. Names that were not in the report, but that she would find in the supplemental files she would read later tonight. She put the report down. She straightened a pen on her desk, then another. She straightened them until they were perfectly parallel, exactly 2 centimeters apart, aligned with the edge of the desk. She looked at them for a moment. "Get me Sector 7's resupply timeline," she told her aide. Kamara had been watching her read the casualty numbers. He was 26 years old and had grown up hearing about Admiral Voss, and had been assigned to her staff 8 months ago, and had been studying her ever since, with the careful attention of someone who did not yet understand what he was looking at. He pulled the Sector 7 file. He watched her read it with the same grocery list attention. He had expected something. He didn't know what. Some signal that the weight of it, the scope of what had just begun, had landed on her the way it had landed on him, the way it sat in his chest like a stone. She handed the file back. "Get some sleep, Kamara." She did not sleep. She sat at her desk with the old ceramic mug and the thermos and the reports, and she worked, and the number of human wars in recorded history sat somewhere behind her eyes like a thing she had long ago stopped carrying, because it had become part of the structure of how she thought. They had had worse. Outside, across 47 systems, the war was 11 hours old. The 0.003 seconds would make sense later. Everything would make sense later. She had done a great deal of building to make it so. The early reports still looked like victory. That was the worst part. Later, when the Council's historians went back through the records and tried to understand where the model had broken, the early reports had looked exactly right. Systems taken. Human forces retreating in good order. Logistics chains disrupted on schedule. The AI's 11 to 19-week timeline was tracking. The delegates in the War Council reviewed the first week's data and felt the clean, functional satisfaction of a plan proceeding as designed. Fleet Commander Sorakel of the Veth did not feel that satisfaction. She was commanding the primary push at the Arcturus Corridor, which was the most strategically important transit point in the entire opening campaign. Control it, and you split human territorial space in two, east from west, supply chain from fleet, communication from command. Taking it was supposed to be a 40-minute action. Her force outnumbered the human defense 3-1. The tactical approach was sound. She had run it herself 4 times. It took 40 minutes. The humans seeded the corridor at the 38-minute mark, exactly when the pressure models said they would break. Sorakel had filed her transit confirmation and moved her fleets through and felt the thing that felt like victory. Then the damage reports came in. 34% of her transit fleet gone. Not damaged, gone. In 40 minutes, against a defending force a third her size, she had lost more ships than the projections had modeled as the worst-case scenario for the entire corridor campaign. She went back through the engagement data herself, frame by frame. She was precise. She was thorough. She was a fleet commander with 40 years of experience across 9 separate engagements. She found it on the 3rd pass. The humans had used their own ships, not as weapons platforms, as projectiles. 4 human vessels, already damaged, already losing structural integrity, had been piloted at ramming velocity into the geometry of her transit formation at the exact moment her fleet was most densely packed in the corridor throat. The AI had calculated that the maneuver was geometrically impossible given the mass and velocity constraints of the human ships involved. The AI had been using the wrong numbers. The human ships had pushed past every structural and engine threshold that any rational model would have set as the operational ceiling. They had pushed so far past those thresholds that the ships had started to break apart in transit. And they had kept going. She pulled the crew records. She stared at them. "Were the crews evacuated?" her second-in-command asked. She put the records down. Her color glands, the Veth equivalent of expression, a thing she had some control over, but not complete control over. "No," she said. "They were not." She filed her report to the War Council. She took extra care with the language, because she understood that what she was putting in the report was the kind of information that needed to be received correctly, not filtered through the framework of what the Council had expected to find, but heard plainly, in simple words, as something new. The human crews did not evacuate their ships before using them as weapons. She included the supplemental file. She almost didn't. She included it because she was precise, and precision meant including data even when data was uncomfortable. The supplemental file contained the final 30 seconds of audio recovered from the black box of the lead human ship, the Meridian, according to the registry, captured before impact. The War Council listened to it. The translators rendered the voices clearly. The crew of the Meridian, in the last 30 seconds of their lives, was laughing. Not the screaming panic of people who had lost their minds. Not the forced bravado of people performing courage for a record they knew would be reviewed. The laughing of people who had made a choice they were completely at peace with, who had decided how to spend the last of themselves, and were spending it exactly as planned, and found something in that, something the Council's translation systems could identify as a sound, but could not find a cultural framework to fully render. It was the sound of people doing what they were built for. The chamber was very quiet. They knew, one of the Keth delegates said, they knew they weren't going to survive the maneuver, and they flew it anyway. Sorakel had been thinking about this for 3 days. "It's not that they didn't value their lives," she said slowly, working through it in real time in front of the Council, because she didn't have a cleaner version yet. "I think they valued something else more." "What?" Vethara asked. "Not yet. They're not fighting to win," she said, and she could hear that the words weren't quite right, weren't quite large enough for the thing she was trying to say. "They're fighting because they're good at it." The Muhari strategic AI, running continuously in the background of the War Council's operations, was processing the engagement data from the first 6 weeks of the campaign. It was very thorough. It reviewed every human tactical decision across every engagement zone and built updated models and refined its projections. It kept producing an error. Not a system error, a categorical error, a place where the human behavior it was observing did not fit cleanly into any of the behavioral models it had been built on. Human commanders across all zones were making decisions that contradicted their own previous decisions. Positions the AI identified as strategically critical were being abandoned. Resources were being allocated in ways that made no sense against the standard optimization models, and then, 3 or 4 moves later, made terrible sense. The AI had a category for this kind of tactical unpredictability. It was called irrationality. But the outcomes were not irrational. The outcomes were, increasingly, the wrong outcomes for the Council's forces. An irrational actor who consistently produced effective results was not irrational. The AI understood this. It updated its category. It did not have a better category to replace it with. It filed the gap as statistical noise and kept running. On the Resolute, Voss reviewed Sorakel's report and the supplemental file. She listened to the audio from the Meridian. She sat with it for a moment. The weight of it had a specific texture. Not grief exactly, not yet. Grief would come later in its own time. But something that acknowledged the Meridian's crew correctly, which meant acknowledging what they had chosen and why, and not softening it into something easier to carry. She put the file down. She picked up her pen. set it on the desk, picked up a second pen, set it beside the first, aligned them, perfectly parallel, 2 centimeters apart. "Kamara," she said, "get me a current status on Sector 7's secondary supply route, the one that officially doesn't exist." He pulled it without asking why. He had stopped asking why 3 weeks ago. He was starting to understand, in the way you understood a very large thing. Slowly, from the outside, one piece at a time, that the Admiral operated at a distance ahead of events that made the asking of questions mostly redundant. He handed her the file. She read it, nodded once, handed it back. Outside, across every contested zone, in every engagement, the Council's AI was classifying and reclassifying and struggling to build the right model for. Human crews were doing the thing that 40,000 simulations had not been able to properly weight. They were finding new ways to do it. That had always been the variable. Not the ships, not the weapons, not the numbers. The variable was what humans did when you backed them into a corner with bad options and a clock running down. They invented. They had been doing it for their entire history. The AI would figure that out eventually. By then, it would be too late for the figuring to help. 6 months in, the Council's War Council stopped using the word timeline. The 11-week model had been revised so many times that revising it had become its own kind of work. A full-time project for a team of analysts whose only job was to take the previous projection and rebuild it against the new data and produce a new number. The new number was always bigger than the old one. The team had stopped presenting it with confidence. They presented it now the way you carry something fragile across a long room, carefully, with full attention on the floor. The Muhari strategic AI had stopped producing a timeline entirely. This had never happened before. The AI had a protocol for situations in which data was insufficient to project. It had a protocol for situations in which enemy behavior exceeded modeled parameters. It did not have a protocol for the specific situation it was now in, which was enough data, accurate data, but the data keeps producing something the model cannot resolve. It filed ongoing exception reports. It kept running. The Council opened back-channeled diplomatic contact in the 5th month, quietly, through a neutral species intermediary on a station that did not appear in any official records. The intermediary delivered a single message to the human diplomatic corps. The Council would like to discuss terms. The message was returned with a contact preference. Not a human diplomat. Not a civilian official. Admiral Sarah Voss. The Council had not been surprised. They had expected it. What surprised them was the second part of the contact preference, the location. Voss would speak with the Grand Chancellor directly. No aides, no record. She would take the call in her quarters, on her ship. She did not travel to a neutral point. She did not send a representative to Covenant Station. She specified a channel, a time, and the precise frequency of the encryption key she expected the Council to use. They used it. Vethara had done this 9 times before. He was very good at it. He knew how to read the organism across from him, how to find the thing underneath the thing they were saying, how to identify what they actually needed versus what they were asking for, how to build a path from the start of a conversation to a place where both parties could find some ground to stand on. He looked at Voss in the communication window and spent the first 30 seconds simply observing. She was sitting at her desk. In the background, he could see a bulkhead, a small shelf, a coffee mug. The mug was old. He had seen it in the footage from the declaration chamber. She was looking at him with the patient attention of a person who has already decided not to be the first one to blink. He began with mutual cost. He presented it carefully. The resources already spent on both sides, the lives already given, the systems already damaged in ways that would take decades to repair. It was not a soft opening. It was an honest one. He was offering to look at the damage together, as 2 parties who had both contributed to it, which was more than most openers gave. She listened. She said nothing. He moved to prolonged suffering. The populations in contested zones, the disruption of trade, of medical supply chains, of the thousand small logistical threads that kept inhabited systems from falling into crisis. Again, honest, not soft. He was not performing compassion. He was presenting data. She listened. He said, "What will it take?" His most direct tool. In 9 wars it had always produced something. A number, a condition, a place to start building. She was quiet for a moment. She looked at something off to the side. He couldn't see what. Then she looked back at him. "New Carthage," she said. 2 words. Flat. The same way she had said "at last" in the declaration chamber, with the specific weight of something that had been held for a long time. He did not know the reference. He ran it through his information systems while keeping his expression steady, which was the kind of thing you learn to do in 4,000 years. The search returned a colonial administrative file. A subnotation in border reclassification records from a negotiation that had happened at the sub-chancellor level, handled by a functionary whose name Vethara had to look up, who was now 3 promotions removed from that desk, and working in resource management in a completely different sector. New Carthage, human colony, outer covenant border zone, population at time of reclassification, 41,000, status, reclassified as administratively non-viable due to border treaty requirements. Effective date, 8 years ago. He looked at the date. He looked at Voss. The colony had gone silent 3 years after the reclassification. That system was, he began. Was, she said. Not sharp, not angry. The word landed the way a door closing quietly lands. Completely, without drama. He had 4,000 years of experience reading faces, and the face in front of him was telling him something he was having trouble categorizing. It was not rage. It was not grief. It was the specific temperature of a decision that had been made a very long time ago, and had been allowed to cool until it was structural, until it was load-bearing, until the person carrying it had reorganized themselves around it so completely that the carrying had become invisible. "We can discuss reparations," he said, "for the colony, for the populations affected." "You can't," she said. She did not say it as cruelty. She said it as a statement of fact, in the same tone she might use to say that a number did not add up, that a supply route was no longer viable. She was telling him the math. You cannot repay 41,000 people who are no longer there to receive payment. You cannot repay a planet. "Then what do you want?" he said, and something in his voice broke slightly. Not a large break. He was too practiced for a large break, but something shifted under the surface of the words. Something that 4,000 years of patience had not entirely been able to train out of him. Because he was beginning to understand, in the way you understood a large thing from the outside, slowly, that he had walked into this conversation thinking he knew its shape. He did not know its shape. "I wanted you to start this," she said. She said it the way she said everything, flat without decoration, as if explaining something obvious to someone who had taken longer than expected to arrive at it. 6 years ago I needed you to start this, so it would be yours. So it would be in the record, clearly, with no room to rewrite, that you reached first, that you declared first, so that when it was over, and it will be over, there would be no question in any court, any historical record, any species memory about who chose this. You took your time, not rage, not vengeance. The exhausted precision of someone who had built a mechanism and then had to live inside it while it ran. He was very still. He understood now what the cold water feeling had been in the declaration chamber. He understood what at last had meant. He understood the 6 years of formal grievances filed and allowed to die in committee. The violations of the Covenant Accords that had been just large enough to produce escalating pressure and just small enough to never cross the line that would make humanity the aggressor. She had written the script. From the beginning, she had needed the Council to declare war, and she had engineered the conditions for them to do so. And then she had waited, for 6 years, patiently, building toward a readiness she would not reveal, building toward the moment when the other party finally did the thing she had been standing at the door waiting for them to do. Code on. Door open. Waiting. "How long have you been ready?" he asked. She looked at the mug on her desk. "Since the paperwork," she said. The colonial reclassification notification. 8 years ago. The piece of paper that arrived on New Carthage 6 months before the silence did. The piece of paper that told 41,000 people what they were now worth to the balance of interspecies border negotiations. He understood. She had not started building when they declared war. She had not started building when the political situation began to escalate. She had started building 8 years ago, the day a functionary she had never met signed a piece of paper about a planet she had been standing on. He had declared war on a civilization that had been ready for 8 years. At last, she had said. Now he understood what she had meant. The war did not end with a battle. There was no single moment. No great fleet engagement. No planetary siege. No last desperate push that broke one side and handed the other its victory in clean, dramatic terms that would survive well in historical summaries. The Council's historians would struggle with this for years afterward. The story kept refusing to resolve into the shape that stories about wars were supposed to resolve into. What actually happened was more like erosion. 8 months in, the Council's internal political situation had become untenable in ways that the opening of the war had not predicted. The species that had signed the declaration unanimously were no longer unanimous. The Keth had a faction that wanted to open separate talks. The Veth had a border dispute with the Muhari that had been tabled during the war's opening months and had now untabled itself with considerable force. The Lan, who had been the quietest voice in favor of the declaration, had quietly begun making separate trade inquiries with human diplomatic contacts, which was not technically a violation of the covenant, but was the kind of thing that made every other signatory look at the Lan with new and focused attention. The Muhari's strategic AI, running its exception reports in an unbroken chain, had finally produced a revised model for human tactical behavior. It was a good model. It was accurate. It was, by the AI's own assessment, the best model it had ever produced. It projected that the war would be over in 4 to 7 years, in humanity's favor. Grand Chancellor Vethara reviewed the model at 0300 station time, alone in his office. He reviewed it 3 times. Then he sat for a long while and did not review anything. The War Council met the next morning. He presented the model. He let them sit with it for a long while, the way a certain kind of teacher lets students sit with a wrong answer until they have found the wrongness themselves. Then he said, "We should talk to Admiral Voss." The signing was not on Covenant Station. Voss had put that in the terms before the formal negotiations even began. A single condition, stated once, not elaborated on, not negotiable. The signing would take place on a human vessel. The Council's delegates would come to the human side of the line. There had been pushback. Of course there had been pushback. There was a great deal of diplomatic precedent around the neutrality of signing locations, around the symbolism of where final agreements were reached, around the way history would read the geography of capitulation. She did not argue with the pushback. She restated the condition once. The pushback stopped. The Council's senior delegates arrived on the Resolute in formal array. 7 species, their ceremonial attendants, the document teams, the translation specialists. They came up the boarding ramp and into the corridors of a human military vessel, and every single surface told them, quietly and without drama, where they were. The lighting was functional. The halls were narrow by Council standards. The crew moved past the delegates with the brisk indifference of people who had somewhere to be and were going there. Nobody had arranged the corridors to look less like a warship. The signing room was the conference room off the main command deck. A long table, standard-issue chairs, a viewport along one wall that showed open space, and at the edge of the frame, one corner of a debris field from an engagement 8 weeks ago that hadn't been cleared yet. The delegates filed in and arranged themselves. Voss was already there. She was sitting at the head of the table, reading something on a datapad. She did not stand when they entered. She looked up, nodded once, the kind of nod that acknowledged presence without performing welcome, and put the datapad down. The document ceremony took 40 minutes. Translations verified, amendments confirmed. The formal language of binding interstellar agreement read aloud in 6 languages by the appropriate officials from each side. Voss listened with the same attention she brought to supply reports. She asked 2 clarifying questions, both technical, both about enforcement mechanisms on specific clauses. She received answers. She nodded. The terms were not punitive. This surprised the delegates, in the way things surprise people who have built an expectation and then found reality doing something different. There were no reparations demands. Or rather, the reparations were structural, built into the terms as binding procedural requirements, as new protections for colonial populations in border zones, as oversight mechanisms with teeth. Not punishment, architecture, built to last. When the document reached her, she picked up a pen, an old one, military issue, the kind that came in packs of 12, from a supply requisition form. She signed without ceremony, without looking at the document again after the pen left the page, and handed the pen to the nearest aide without looking at that either. Done. She stood. She thanked the delegates for their time in the flat, correct language of formal closure. She left the room. The hallway outside was empty. Her quarters were 60 meters down the corridor, and she walked them with the same brisk indifference as her crew. And she went inside, and the door closed. The mug was on the desk. It was always on the desk. New Carthage Mining Co., in letters that had gone from orange to gray over 12 years of handling, of being filled and emptied and carried from ship to ship, from station to station. From the last morning she had spent on a planet that still existed, to this morning in a room that was 60 meters away from the table where she had just finished what she had started 8 years ago. She picked it up. She didn't drink from it. She held it. Both hands. The way you hold something when you're not doing anything with it, when the holding is the entire point. For 6 years she had known what to do next. There was always a next thing. A report, a projection, a supply timeline, a tactical adjustment, a political calculation. The mechanism had been running, and she had been running it, and the running of it had been the shape of every day for 6 years. And she had been good at it, had been built for it in the specific way that people who have already lost the thing that mattered most to them are sometimes built for the long, cold work of doing something about it. The mechanism was done. The anger, the sweet and familiar thing she had reached for so many times when something softer tried to surface, had nothing left to do. It had been a tool, and she had used it, and now it was just wait. She stood at her desk and held the mug, and felt the particular silence of a person who has arrived somewhere, and found that arriving was the whole of it. New Carthage was not coming back. She had known that from the beginning. She had never been doing this to bring it back. She had been doing this so that what happened to it would mean something, would be written into the structure of what came after, would be the reason that the next colony in the next border zone got the protections that 41,000 people had not gotten. That was the math. She put the mug down. She sat down. She pulled the next report toward her. There was always a next report, and she opened it and began to read. Somewhere in the Council's administrative archives, a junior analyst named Priva Soth, reassigned, recently, back to a desk that dealt with colonial records, was updating the file on Admiral Sarah Voss. Service record, strategic history, post-war assessments. She was thorough. She cross-referenced dates. She found the grievance. Pre-war, 8 years ago. Formal diplomatic filing, submitted through the correct channels, in the correct format, with all the correct attachments and citations. A complaint regarding the Council's administrative reclassification of New Carthage Colony. Filed by a Lieutenant Commander Sarah Voss. Filed 6 months before the colony went silent. Prevosoth read it carefully. The body of the grievance was thorough and precise. 8 pages of documented harm, legal argument, and cited precedent. She read all of it. The final line was standard closing language, protocol language, the kind of language that got stamped at the bottom of formal documents as a matter of form. Humanity respectfully requests review. Should review be denied, we consider this matter unresolved and reserve the right to revisit it at a time of our choosing. Stamped below it, in the red ink of administrative processing, reviewed, no action required. 8 years ago. Prevosoth sat with that for a long time. She thought about the declaration chamber. About 2 words said in a flat voice, with the weight of something held for a very long time. She thought about what those 2 words had actually meant. Not defiance. Not arrogance. The clean, exhausted relief of a person who had filed the paperwork, waited for the answer, received the answer, and then spent 8 years making absolutely certain that when she came back to the matter, it was on her terms, in her time, with the record showing exactly who had forced her hand. She had told them. She had told them 8 years ago, in protocol language, in the last line of a formal grievance that had been stamped and filed and forgotten by someone who was now 3 promotions removed from the desk. At a time of our choosing. Prevosoth added a single note to the Voss file. She typed it, read it back, and left it. She told us. She closed the file. Outside her office window, in the slow turning of Covenant Station's observation ring, the stars were the same stars they had always been. The border zones were different now. The maps were different. The agreements were different. Binding, structural, built with teeth. Everything else was the same, except the math. The math was different. And somewhere on a ship, 60 light-years away, an admiral was reading a supply report and drinking cold coffee from a chipped ceramic mug. And the letters on the side had gone from orange to gray, and she was already thinking about what came next. She had always known what came next. That had always been the whole of it.